It is my pleasure to be introducing today Angelo Gargiulo, who is a PhD student at the Department of History of Ghent University. He has trained as a classicist at the University of Pisa and at Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa, where he obtained both his MA and BA degrees. His research interests are move along two main axes: late antique prose, with a particular interest in the philological and interpretative issues related to the letters of Isidoro of Pelusium on the one hand, and late antique meteorology on the other. Among his publications, I would like to mention his 2023 article per un'edizione delle lettere 2.284 e 3.243 di Isidoro di Perusio sul ruolo della donna, and the paper Note al testo di due epistole esegetiche di Isidoro di Peluso, which he co-authored with Lorenzo Colombo. Currently, he is carrying out the FWO project Every Thunder Means Something, addressing late antique meteorology. Whereas current environmental history of late antiquity tends to focus on the catastrophic, Angelo is investigating how ideas and practices in relations with the weather were woven into late antique society. Today, Angelo will present a paper entitled Meteorology and the Culture of the Self in John Lydus De Ostentis. Angelo, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Georgia, for this very kind introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to see all the people attending, and I'm really excited to have this occasion to share my results to this public. So maybe I'd like to share my screen, if possible. Okay. No. Can you see it? Okay, perfect. And can you hear me well, of course? Okay, so it was already stated in the introduction. My current project, together with my two supervisors that I have to thank for this presentation for the project as a whole, that are Pede van Nuffelen and Stefan van den Broeke. The project is about the cultural embeddedness, and I'm going to try to explain this of late antique meteorology. In this presentation in particular, I will share some very preliminary results of a reading I conducted together with my two supervisors of notations of meteorological phenomena in a particular text of John Lydus, that is a 6th century author. The text is De Ostentis. I will try to demonstrate how most of the reports of weather phenomena in De Ostentis have a strong moral, political, or scientific background. And now this is very clear from the text as a whole, but also from one of its sections, one of the strangest sections, or one of the least immediately reconducted to 6th century environment, that is the last section, a parapegma, an astrometeorological calendar attributed to Claudius Tuscus. So I wanted to say something about my project as a whole, but Georgia did it already. So about the structural embeddedness of meteorology. There is a book about ancient meteorology here on the right, the one by Libataub. There are works about Carolingian meteorology, Byzantine meteorology, Anglo-Saxon.
Sorry for interrupting. I think we lost your microphone for a second.
Oh, okay.
Can you?
I can go closer. Can you hear me now?
Somehow.
Okay, you can.
Yes, we got it.
Oh, okay, perfect. I mean, yeah, and interrupt me if I'm not understandable anymore. Okay, yeah, I was basically just saying that there are no studies on late antique meteorology as a whole. There is a small article by Telellis about Byzantine meteorology that covers some of these things. So one of the basic aims of the project was to cover this gap, but of course, to deal with all late antique meteorology would have been quite long, probably undoable in a project. So our focus is on the 6th century. What is meteorology? This definition is as vague as it can be, approaches the prediction of weather and explanation of the causes of meteorological phenomena, but that's because, as some of you may know, to define meteorology in antiquity is quite difficult. There are some texts that could be considered as meteorological, for example, Aristotle, and that is the most stereotypical example, but sometimes they don't agree in the range of topics they cover. Most of the things that we would not consider meteorological, as earthquakes or comets, are usually considered as such in antiquity. And so I think that's keeping this very vague definition and understanding meteorological phenomena as sometimes even natural phenomena, what we consider natural phenomena, may help to at least to adopt a late antique point of view. What is the cultural embeddedness? Basically, an in-depth study of how ideas and practices in relation with the weather were woven into late antique society, characterized by continuity with classical antiquity and change. But I put in the title also this notion of, yeah, I follow Foucault in saying culture of the self, and probably it would be better to follow Hadot here, what since in philosophy, in calling it self-government or technology of the self. Basically, those of you who are familiar with Hadot probably know that he analyzed ancient philosophy with an intent of practices, and now practices were valued because of the ethical effect they could obtain on the practitioner, even more than because of their actual content. This analysis, this emphasis on practices have been applied also to other ancient sciences. I'm thinking about works by Serafina Cuomo on ancient mathematics, or even Li Bataub, the author of ancient meteorology, on astrology. And so the idea was also to make the jump to late antique meteorological texts. That I will hope to demonstrate some of this analyzing John Lydus. Also, just to complete this this introduction, we try also to apply some very contemporary notion. This notion on environing I found particularly interesting. What's the cultural process whereby humans perceive and conceptualize environments in their imagination, and in some ways not too dissimilar to what we are doing with. And this is a very human approach to the report of weather phenomena. This is why I think that in some ways it is true for our project what Jankovic in Reading the Skies, a cultural study of English weather, says for...
We lost you again for a bit, I think.
Sorry?
Still can't hear you.
Okay. Still you can't hear me well.
No. I mean, no, like very, very low.
Has it improved?
Now it's better. Whatever
Okay.
you did now, that's the one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, how much was it understandable? Should I repeat like most?
But Dan interrupted you when we lost you, so we're covered.
Right away,
It's gone,
which
yeah.
is just
okay.
the phrase you are saying.
And then, of course, in the question time, there's something that was absolutely unclear.
Don't go back. It was just the phrase you were just saying.
Okay, thank you. So just in some way, we think that what Jankovic says about the 18th century meteorology is true also for late antique meteorology, just that it was an engagement with the human rather than the physical environment. And so was the main objective of my analysis of De Ostentis by John Lydus, and in general the text that we have selected as a kind of case study for this project, to demonstrate the practices of weather forecasting and reporting are never just that. They simultaneously translate and operationalize scientific, political, and religious positions. Now, sorry, the focus on the 6th century, this a century that has been investigated under a meteorological, if you want, point of view, but just because this is something very common in scholarship that is booming at the moment for especially climatological history and environmental history as a whole. And so the 6th century is a century full of natural catastrophes, especially around Constantinople, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Some of you may be familiar with the dark cloud covering the skies during the winter of 536. And these have been studied, especially very recently. A very recent reference is Meyer 2024, the other age of Justinian, arguing the response to increasing number of environmental challenges, maybe also among the causes of the tumultuous changes of society between the 6th and the 7th century. There are debates about interpretation to be given to unusual weather phenomena, discussion on meaning of natural events in most of the Constantinopolitan milieu, but most of the studies are about catastrophes, and there is a lack of studies about ordinary weather phenomena. This is one of the other aims of the project as a whole. Now, to go to the author, I don't know how many of you are familiar with John Lydus. Basically, he spent most of his career in Constantinople. He held high court and state offices, especially in the Praetorian Prefecture of the East. now I still keep speaking with the phone and sharing with the computer, and I think it's working. And I will cut some of the final parts of the presentation. Don't worry, I'm not keeping you like so much.
You do your thing. We can do with that. No worries. Don't cut anything. Go ahead.
So my focus was on De Ostentis, and this hopefully was already understandable. Most of the scholarship on Lydus, I was saying, hasn't had that different of a judgment on thoughts, just under the point of view that the three works have been investigated with a particular focus on the Magistratibus. So I'm returning to the... With a particular focus on the Magistratibus, not so much on the Mons and the Ostentis, just because Lydus has received quite often the label as antiquarian writer. That means a writer that is particularly useful because of the actual content we can recover from his works of ages preceding him, but not so much because of its positioning in 6th century Constantinople. And this is particularly strange, especially because Lydus was quite important in 6th century Constantinople. This monograph by Michael Maas is one of the first one trying to fill the gap in some ways. So Maas discusses especially the Magistratibus, but he has a very interesting chapter that I'm going to develop above the Ostentis and the Mensibus. The Ostentis is an antiquarian work, but Lydus had very different aims. So creation of a complete and useful treatise about how to predict something from natural phenomena and why this matters. Now, if you want to identify one word that has continuous digression, this is rather the Mensibus, where more visible is the erudite curiosity, but fragmentary status, I'm going to return on the textual status, does not help. While De Ostentis, erudite digressions are within this very precise framework. Moreover, emphasis on observation on its necessity and needs to a divine providence governing the world is a concept that I'm going to return. Now that, so before focusing on one specific part of the Ostentis, that is this parapema of Claudius Tussus, I'm going just to make a broader presentation of some passages that I think can be useful to understand what I mean if I'm saying moral, scientific, political background of observation of celestial phenomena. Just a small parenthesis on the manuscript, because the main manuscript for the three Lydian works, but the Mensibus is particularly fragmentary here, is this one, very ancient, very important as testimony, the basis of what is still the standard edition from the Ostentis, that is Wachsmuth 1897, but you see the manuscript has serious problems that led Wachsmuth to say that in che laguinaria potius quam in bibliotheca codex asservatus esse videretur, and I think that we can agree on this. By the way, Wachsmuth was also among the people not really loving the works of Lydus. He states that he's doing the edition because it may be useful because of the antiquarian content, but of course these are works that he really is not enjoying reading. Luckily, we have a later edition of the Ostentis, Bendy 2013, but it is unfinished because Bendy died before finishing the work. Luckily, consulted other manuscripts, so the text is better, at least as far as the Ostentis goes. But you will see on the TLG, there's still Wachsmuth. I will project some of the text in Wachsmuth, and sometimes it appears very fragmentary. To contextualize a bit what Lydus is saying, the Ostentis, I'm not reading the whole prologue because I think that otherwise I run out of time. But basically, at the very beginning, he states very clearly his intentions. He says, I formerly used to be of the opinion of the many about these things. What are these things? The predictive value of celestial phenomena. Not the belief that celestial phenomena can influence the future, because this would have been quite clearly unchristian. But the debate was open for how much they could predict. They could at least give hints about the evolution of the future. Let us say that it was the opinion of the many, hinting so to debates ongoing in 6th century Constantinople. But after experience demonstrated the truth about these things, namely the appearance of a comet, which was predicting the attack of the Persians, that was successfully dealt with by Justinian, he thought that, okay, observation from celestial signs work. They really can predict things. And so
I was induced finally to write about these matters, partly thinking that the subject would become mandatory to remembrance of me, and partly believing it preposterous and replete with envy to read so many labors about the ancients and for their teaching about these matters, to remain continuously hidden. In some ways, the antiquarian name is there, is not denying it. Of course, it's very interested in everything pertaining to the Roman past. But there's something more, and I think that this something more is specified a little bit better in the rest of the work. Now, if I read passages like this, you might think that it's impossible to consider this work as other than very clear connected to very ongoing debates in the age of Lydus. And so why have there been doubts about this? Why has this work be considered in a different way? Because I'm arguing here, given this very general structure of the work, that contrary to common interpretation, De Ostentis is far from being only a compilation of texts of random antiquarian value, and each of the highlighted sections contains reflections by the author on the aims and methods of his own work. But then what's the main problem? The sections that are not highlighted, because here Lydus is very frequently just transcribing text that he claims to have taken from ancient authors. Most of the times we don't know the source at all. There are ongoing debates, of course, but it's very difficult to reconstruct the sources. Essays have been published about how we can reconstruct an 8th century before Christ Etruscan calendar starting from the work of Lydus. But that's because, of course, this work has a very variegated structure, and sometimes some of these works seem very hardly reconnected to the debates is addressing to in the introduction. But I'm going to address the fact that they may by addressing the very last section, the astrometeorological paradigm of Claudius Tuscus. Some of the passages that I think make it clear what I'm saying. Lydus states his point not only in the prologue, but in many of the highlighted sections. This is because before some observation related to the movements of the moon. And I find this passage, unfortunately, the text is not in good shape, but it's in a better shape in Bendy. I find this passage very revealing, just because of this defining nature, thesis, kyrix, ton aporriton, herald of hidden things, or otherwise it has been translated of things that have been concealed to us. And so continuously, not outside Dementia is addressing some opponents, probably people who don't believe in the predictive value of celestial signs. They censor the methods by which they are led to conjecture the future. To be occupied with the contemplation of stars does not indeed render one outside piety, but still more, if it is possible to contemplate the all-wise divine providence of the ineffable Father of the universe through his works themselves, and to be able, God being guide, to admire and to discourse about celestial phenomena, so far as it is possible. I just highlighted, I found interesting that this nature is kyrix ton aporriton, and the ineffable Father of the universe is Patros Arritu. And then in general, we also probably should keep in mind that Lydus had been a Neoplatonic scholar. He studied with Agapius, a disciple of Proclus, and I think there is a notion of kyrix and some aporriton. There are some echoes of this, but we don't have the time to discuss this. Just, I think the moral background should be appearing quite clear. The political, just continuous references to contemporary political events, sometimes really contemporary political events. Like here, one must rightly honor providence for the duration of the present fortunate reign. No eclipse has occurred under this sign. Sometimes it's more difficult with texts that are just translated from others, but already some scholars have argued that Lydus is continually quoting, for example, Persian invasions, behavior of rulers, something that could be applied to 1st century before Christ Rome as Constantinople, and that this ambiguity seems also to be deliberate. So the Ostentis is a didactic treatise, not in the sense that it was taught in school, of course, but that the idea reader must, cause the Ostentis an handbook, a useful handbook. The idea reader learns about the scientific, moral, and political implications of celestial observations. I was analyzing, I find interesting to understand this approach, the usage of the word Tavmazin, to marvel at. One slide states that is it possible to Tavmazin tinteu pronian, the providence of God. In another instance, Tavmazitim psychin anthropo dinastaigomeno teu dialegeste about celestial phenomena, so to admire that the mind of the man is able to investigate celestial phenomena. And then, last passage, to admire nature and the impenetrability, avaton, ton enafti, theorimato, of the investigations regarding it. Now, all this for passage where it's quite clear what's the basic aim of Lydus. And I'm concluding with this, what if we have something like the last section, that is just a complete astrometeorological calendar attributed by Lydus to this Claudius Tuscus, but we just have his name in the title, and then after the section, Lydus says, okay, Tuscus wasn't the only one making this kind of prediction. There are other authorities, even Julius Caesar, doing this kind of prediction, and so I mean, it lists these authorities because this text is a parapegma, an astrometeorological calendar, and very happily in the audience there is Daryl Leude. Probably knows about this because he wrote the only monograph about parapegmata. Basically, there are only astrological, there are all kinds of parapegmata, but it may suffice here to say that this text is just a complete calendar linking rising and setting of stars to meteorological occurrences. So it runs as is in the second part of the slide. January the 1st, on the calendar, long days begin. March 31st, showers came, breaking Pefike. November the 20th, unpleasant storm, Aidis Himon. December the 10th, March north wind, and the sky is black from storm. With sometimes it seems also observational in the way that they really seem observation that sometimes were taken and transcribed. Here, no contemporary political reference, no Persian attacks, no reference to rulers, no contextualization of the moral background of observation, sometimes oddly specific observational notes. So what we can say of this text, if we want to apply the framework I've already applied, basically, for one thing, I'm unfortunately skipping these details about parapegmata, we know the author. We don't know anything, of course, about Claudius Tuscus because we only have his name, but at least we know that his name sounds Etruscan. And Lydus himself writes after the parapegma, this writing were taken from the sacred writings of the Tusci, of the Etruscans. So in some ways, there is a desire for completeness. Lydus was stating at the beginning of the Ostentis that he's going to explain in a very scientific, the handbook of mass way, how to predict something from celestial phenomena, and this applies always. And this is a complete calendar, probably built for a very different age, situation, whatever the origin, but this is complete. And then we have, of course, authority of the ancients, but even more, value of the Etruscan thought. Lydus was born in Lydia, in Philadelphia. There is one of the supposed origin of the Etruscan population, but not only for the reason is very, as it feels a special connection with the Etruscans, specified at the beginning of the Ostentis, for example, by the myth of Tejas. It's narrated in the prologue. Tejas is the founding prophet of Etruscan religion, miraculous child with the features of a wise old man who sprang from a plowed furrow in the fields of Tarquini and sang out the elements of what the Romans called the Etrusca disciplina. Tejas that, according to Lydus, is also assimilated to Hermes, Chtonios, and is explaining the meaning of celestial phenomena. I find it's interesting because Tejas, Hermes, and then nature, in the passage that I showed, is defined as Kyrix, as herald, messenger of hidden things. But then, of course, authority of the ancient. And so, what could a 6th century reader learn in some ways from the text of Tuscus? The normative practice of observing and reporting weather phenomena, with all of its moral and political significance, is what is exemplified by Lydus' collection of texts. And only in second place, the strict epistemic content of the prediction. That is not to say that he wasn't believing to the epistemic content. Probably yes, just probably not the most important thing. And so to parapegma can is something to a Constantinopolitan audience, the political value, religious embedment, and correct interpretation of celestial phenomena. That is what Lydus had in mind as a broader purpose of his treatise. Now, I am inside the 30 minutes. Unfortunately, I haven't touched a lot of an issue, for example, that is quite big, the Christianity or discussion about the Christianity or not of John Lydus and all this content, but I think that it's safe to stop here just to leave enough time for the questions. Here are some bibliographical references, and I really thank you for your attention despite the troubles.
Thank you very much for powering through that problem that inevitably will appear at some point. But most of all, thank you very much for introducing the topic and the scholarship on ancient meteorology and on John Lydus. showing how this has not only scientific but also philosophical, moral, political and religious ramifications. The floor is now open to conversation. Feel free, please, to jump in with any question or comment. Andy, please. And then
Yeah, thank you very much, Angelo. This is really intriguing. I'd like to start maybe with a more general question about reception, because you mentioned the manuscript, the earliest manuscript, which is 9th or 10th century, and Photius has an abbreviation of it. Are there later manuscripts? How popular is this? Or is just after Photius says, okay, this text is sort of, it's rubbish, let it go? Or is there a certain type of popularity? And in what kind of context are we looking for an interest in this text?
Okay, you can hear me again, right? Okay, yeah, and thank you for the question. Yeah, if I understand it correctly, it's about the popularity, basically, of this work. I mean, I must admit, I can't say specifically how much, like in how many later texts this work is reflected, but for sure it was popular. I mean, yeah, Photius is saying that it's rubbish, but it's also, I mean, it's own judgment. And by the way, he was reading this. The most important manuscript is that, but then we have later section, for example, the very fragmentary passage about nature as herald of hidden things. It's in much better shape in Bendy just because he consults another much later manuscript from the 14th century that is just entitled very about the movements of the moon, and it just reports that section of the Lydian text. About the popularity, I was stricken, for example, by once I was just investigating one of the small introductory sections to it was to earthquakes in the Ostentis, and exactly the same text, not exactly the same text of Lydus, I mean, basically the same, but with some very small variation, reappears in Michael Psellos. So, I mean, without quoting really the source, and then I discovered that I wasn't the one discovering it, because there are already 2 Italian articles by Gualtiero Rota discussing the sources of the seismology of John Lydus, quoting that, noticing that these seismological sections of Lydus reappeared inside a later Byzantine author. So basically, this text was read. But I think the question could also be expanded to, I mean, it's a question that I've investigated only marginally, I think, in the presentation, also because of time restrictions, like debates about how right it is to attribute a predictive value to celestial phenomena. I mean, there were debates probably already in Constantinople in the 6th century. If we read Photius, we get the impression that these debates have always been along, but then at the same time, this is one of the branches, I'd say, of ancient meteorology that has always been practiced with a continuity that is quite striking. Even I'm referring to this small article by Telelis about Byzantine meteorology that I find very, very useful in tracing a synthesis of meteorological thought during the centuries. Telelis makes a sort of distinction, not so clear-cut, of course, between texts dealing with the explanation of the causes of weather phenomena. It is true that Christianization of society brought kind of very different opinion on certain topics, but texts dealing with weather prognostication, the continuity here is quite striking. And even parapegmata, if you read like what Who reports in a section about parapegmata, Tuscus is far from being isolated in the 6th century. Even Aetius reports a parapegmata, and there are parapegmata in the Byzantine Geoponica, so later always referring to the same authorities. So in this, the popularity of this kind of things, I think, has been uninterrupted.
Yeah, no, it doesn't surprise me. I'm also, I mean, you can see in Byzantium also the continuation of astrology, and it's the same kind of principle. I mean, principle, but just some more of that. So I'm not surprised. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please, then Marion.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Angelo. So thank you so much for this. As you might know, I'm a big fan of, narrations of catastrophe, and how appearance of meteorological signs are considered to be, omens, bad omens for the approaching of catastrophes. So this is something that we find not just in Greek Byzantium, but also in Syriac accounts. You always have things appearing in the sky. You have comets and rains and thunders, and they're always anticipating something really, really bad that is going to happen. But my question is, and this is really a question born out of ignorance, is that, so John Lydus was a Christian, right? Yes, we agree on that. Okay. So my question is, from the accounts that I'm more familiar with, which are the Syriac ones, there is always this justification of the endurance of catastrophes as, you know, you need to you know, go through penance for all the sins of the pagans and the other Christians. And you know, for instance, you have this Syriac Orthodox accounts, and they're like, oh, but they're very bad Nestorians, and this is their fault. So my question is, do we find something similar in the accounts by John Lydus about, you know, why all these bad things are happening, and whose fault is that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is actually a very interesting question, because I think, I mean, of course, I'm not so familiar as you with Syriac sources, but I mean, I'm familiar with other specifically Christian sources from the 6th century, and the account of catastrophes are in this quite similar in this framework. I'm thinking about John Malalas, just to remain to contemporary with Lydus. I mean, one interesting fact is that Lydus quotes, for example, the dark cloud of 536, he quotes earthquakes happening close to his home, to Philadelphia and Lydia. He quotes a lot of catastrophes, but this doesn't seem to be his main point. I mean, this is also why this text is particularly interesting if our framework was to start investigating meteorological phenomena, not from the catastrophical point of view. I mean, Lydus was living like Acacius, like John Malalas, like Procopius, in a world that probably was enduring like a lot of catastrophes that had like very clear effects, and this is fair to the most of the writings. But Lydus doesn't seem to delve a lot into this. Of course, we find this kind of blurred boundary between humans seeing catastrophical events. I mean, we find throughout, if we scroll the De Ostentis, most, even of the text directly translated by John Lydus from supposed ancient sources, mention altogether bad behavior of rulers, earthquakes, invasions, like in a kind of mix where you understand that it's not really a clear boundary between what is the catastrophic on the natural point and the human perspective, the human causes of catastrophes. But then I would say that, yeah, apart from this this kind of commission between the human disaster and the catastrophic or meteorological event, I wouldn't say that it's within the main framework of the Ostentis to discuss theological causes of catastrophes. I would rather say that the main framework of the Ostentis is more a kind of scientific observation slash also of what's going to happen on bed, but not, I mean, I don't know how clear it's going to be, but yeah, I just wouldn't say for the Ostentis, but not even for most of the Lydian works, that this Christian framework of equiparing sin and catastrophe is the main point. That of course would bring to the main question of John Lydus was a Christian. How can we call John Lydus a Christian? And that's an interesting point, of course, and a lot has been written about this. I found quite interesting an introduction to a very recent translation of the Mensibus. Misha Uker, I think, was the author. They were just summarizing some of the very recent debates. The main article has been one by Caldellis, stating that John Lydus simply, we can't say that he was Christian because he's not interested in Christian things. His works don't have any kind of Christian framework, but they have very well a Neoplatonic framework, if we want, but not a Christian one, and so on. But I think basically, for one, we don't have enough information. I mean, the very fact that he was occupying very important positions under Justinian on that age means that we can't automatically assume that if he's not interested in the Christian framework, what he's saying, he automatically was not Christian. And then the debates of the discussion of Booker was more detailed. Like, of course, not all Christians in the century Constantinople were interested in the same ways, the same degrees to doctrinal controversies. But of course, yeah, I'd say that the Christianity or not, I would never say that I'm sure that John Lydus wasn't Christian, and I wouldn't say this, but his worldview is very peculiar, to say the least, especially compared to contemporary like Malala's and so on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Marion, please.
Thank you so much, Angelo, for this rich talk. I had two questions, and you just answered the first. But secondly, I was curious, you have spoken both about personal experience of weather, personal observation, but also about the authority of the ancients. And so I was curious, in John Lydus, how does this combination work between people's own observation and then the authority of previous sources? Does he privilege one over the other, or does he reflect on this?
Thank you for the question. I'm really happy because these are questions that are helping me to also to make some points that I probably I wish to have done in the presentation, because yes, this is a very interesting point. I feel that is one of the features that I was mentioning in De Ostentis. Apparently, it's difficult to disentangle. We have on one side continuous references to the authority of the ancient. We have something like the Tussus Parapegma that, of course, I mean, we don't know the source, but unless Lydus was completely inventing the source, we can't exclude even this was composed centuries ago in a completely different place for a completely different context. And so, I mean, the epistemic content in this is quite difficult to recover. At the same time, I think that Lydus basically cares about about always inserting at least something, even when he's reporting the most apparently detached of the sources. He cares about inserting at least something that in some ways reconnects to contemporary reality. And I'm saying in the chapter when he clearly speaks for himself, this is not in doubt, because we find all references to contemporary political events. We find even like providentialistic reference to how this thing led to didn't lead to this, and so we had to thank God providence. But in a sense, this is the thing I was saying about this kind of probably deliberate ambiguity in chapters when it's just translating other authors. Sometimes just the outcome of certain celestial phenomena is vague enough to reflect some of contemporary anxieties, I'd say. That, of course, doesn't solve. I mean, if we turn to parapegmata, yeah, it's an incredibly difficult question. We have this text that continue to be quoted with references to the same authorities. So if Julius Caesar was a parapegmatist and was considered to be a parapegmatist, then you have Julius Caesar quoted in a 6th century text, and then you have in the Byzantine Geoponica these same authorities, Eudoxus, making the prediction quoted. And so how much people attribute this some kind of epistemic value to the content of this prediction? I think this is, of course, I think a different question. Probably in the audience, Leo may say something about this, but I wouldn't say that these reports were believed to be completely just a claim to the authority. I think that there was some actual epistemic content that was believed to be there inside, even when not immediately clear. But that is just an incredibly complex topic.
This is very interesting. Thank you.
I have a question in the chat from Georgia. Could you expand a bit on the Neoplatonic influence on John Lydus?
Yeah, very happy for this question. Yeah, basically, it says in, I don't remember whether the Magistratibus or the Mensibus, but Lydus writes that he was attending the lessons of Agapius, and he really enjoyed it, so he's not denying any of his Neoplatonic background or worldview. And then of course, how far this arrived. For example, one of the main arguments for Caldellis for claiming that Lydus was not a Christian was that, according to Caldellis, Lydus was advocating for a world that was not created, for the absence of creation, but it's something that's been debated, and probably Caldellis was not right in this. Never Lydus says this so clearly. I think, for what I can say about De Ostentis, passages like as the one about nature, this revealing of hidden truths, this progressive revealing, I wouldn't say that they bring to a full-fledged cosmology or hierarchy of the being as it would be a Neoplatonist one, but for sure, I mean, I think that they demonstrate some kind of quite strong influence. There wasn't, I mean, I'd say that in this case, the case of Lydus wasn't isolated in century Constantinople, so in this is not exceptional. I'd say it's more exceptional. That is, yeah, it doesn't try to apparently to Christianize in any way this kind of references.
Thank you very much. Andy has another question. Please, Andy.
Yeah, just a last one that ties into all of this narrative about whether he's a Christian or not. It strikes me, well, no, my question would be, can you, if you really look, can you find even sort of allusions to biblical next? Because also this is the question, well, Albert asked the question, so does he refer to the birth of Christ and this kind of thing? I guess the answer is no to that. But in terms of, because of course you have the examples in the Gospels of the darkness that comes over when Christ is crucified, this kind of thing. And so it would obviously be very sort of tempting to put that in somewhere, but he can't because he's sort of not expressing any kind of Christian. But is there any type of allusion to any biblical kind of framework, or is there nothing at all?
Oh yeah. This also is very interesting because actually there are allusions to the Bible, and actually the Ostentis is the Lydian text with the highest number of allusions to the Bible. That says quite a lot of like how few they are in the other works. There are, I mean, the main problem is that there are in the very prologue of the Ostentis, but the very prologue is not in the main manuscript. It's a fragment that has been reconnected to the beginning of the Ostentis. Both Wachsmuth and Bendy make the Ostentis begin with this fragment. And this fragment just, I mean, it makes a very terminological question. He says that it discusses the Hebrew terms for portents, celestial signs, and then it reconnects to the Greek terms. But I mean, I'd say there are a lot of references to the Bible in this, because it just starts by the length among the Hebrews defined the celestial phenomena in this way, and then he quotes the Bible. I don't remember how many times, but in that, only in that fragment, it was quite a number of times. Now, I think, I mean, for sure, I wouldn't say, even if you want to attribute this fragment to the beginning of the Ostentis, that is adding anything particularly more Christian through the framework in the way that is making a specifically terminological question. I mean, his point is more philological, as Lydus can be sometimes, than other. But then, of course, if we want to believe that this was the first fragment of the Ostentis, it's making a very terminological discussion. But at the same time, one is there to believe, okay, he composed this kind of works that, if we want to refer to allusions to debates going on to Photius and to whatever, was already dubious. I mean, could have been considered a dubious work in its intention. And so in some ways is putting reference to the Bible at the beginning of his work, just because, I mean, he felt in some ways compelled to. Now, I honestly feel that this fragment doesn't solve a lot of things. I mean, of course, if we want to believe it's the first fragment, that there are good reasons to believe this, it gives reference to the Bible. That is what we look for. But then I'd say the main question would be how much these references are Christianizing the framework of Lydus, and I'd say not so much in this case.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you very much.
I saw in the chat, sorry, that Darren has a question, if there's time.
Darren is next asking the question, please.
Okay, great. Thanks for this, Angelo. I really love the context that you're giving to Clodius Tuscus here, because I've always been really puzzled by that bit of text. And my own approach to it wasn't to try to sort of fit it into what Lydus is doing. I was trying to deal with, it's sort of the crime of dealing with fragments, in a sense that I was pulling out this text from Lydus to try and talk about it in relation to other texts in that genre, but you're giving it this much richer context, which I really appreciate, and I'm very, very interested to hear your take on it. So that's not my question. That's just a comment to say, really nice work. Thank you for that. And my question is, just to go back to the title of the talk, you talked, the title has to do with the self, and I see some political stuff in here, and I can sort of make some connections in my own head, but I want to hear how you connect up the dots. Where is Lydus's self in this, or is it Lydus's self that you're talking about? And so how does the culture of the self come into this whole picture?
Yeah, thank you for the appreciation and for the question. Now, I think that it's safe to say, but I was already alluding to this, that among the many definitions, now at this moment, I will even change the title. I will use spiritual exercise more than, but I mean, I'm going to explain this. I mean, of spiritual exercises / technology of the self / culture of the self is something that was born in the work of Hadot, with an emphasis of practice of ancient philosophy, and then it was borrowed by Foucault, and Foucault uses most culture of the self for its own name. So I mean, these practices have been taken under the name of culture of the self, but the aim of Foucault wasn't exactly the same. Foucault was more focusing on the self, on how these practices are elevating the self, even for ancient philosophy. There's something that I think sometimes is possible to recover. For example, I mean, I'm now reading John Philoponus' Meteorology. At the very beginning, it states, of course, that the investigation of the causes of meteorological phenomena can bring the soul to its perfection. There is something not new to antiquity. But I think that in the case of Lydus, and also in general, it's more fair to say that there is an ethical background to this. I mean, in some ways, observing, predicting meteorological phenomena, all this handbook that Lydus is preparing is directed at elevating, in some ways, your soul through understanding how to predict, why it's necessary to predict, and everything that I said. But then, of course, the main emphasis is not on the self, not in the sense that it would attribute it to the self. I hope that this answers enough.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Well, on this note, I would like to thank our speaker today for a very good paper, and to everyone in the room for taking part in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Angelo. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you all
day.
for joining.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.